Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, here in the middle of good old Iowa, between the confluence of two rivers, here in Des Moines on Iowa Catholic Radio. So wonderful to have you with us. You probably know me as the morning show host on the Catholic Morning Show on Iowa Catholic Radio. Bud, what might other folks know you from?
I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College right there in downtown Des Moines, so holding down the fort when it comes to our science, history, and English classes.
We have been doing this for a while, folks, and it's so wonderful to have you with us here on The Uncommon Good. Catholic social teaching, the common good, all sorts of wonderful things that we're glad that you get to join us to talk about here on the weekend. We want to say thank you to Imogene Ingredients, here again in Des Moines, Imogene Ingredients. But I like to think of it that if you have a wonderful livestock, that you want to have shiny coats, and just you look in their eyes and you go, that livestock animal, they're a happy animal, beaming out radiance. I hope our show does something similar for the souls of everybody who encounter it over the weekend.
Yeah, I was out in rural Iowa this past week and seeing some of the cattle and things out there, so my mind naturally turned to Imogene Ingredients. Certainly grateful they underwrite the show. So
thank you again, Imogene Ingredients. You make all of this possible, and for all of the people who listen to The Uncommon Good and happen to need, cattle feed, Imogene Ingredients. I think you can take that look at that at imogeneingredients.com. Today on the show, we're going to continue our grand religion and technology series that we've been doing this year. The sub-series, of course, is going through the Vatican II documents regarding those in the same vein. We're going to do part 2 on Gaudium et Spes. Did I say that right?
Gaudium et Spes.
There you go. So you're going to want to make sure to stick around. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us here on Iowa Catholic Radio on The Uncommon Good. But we're rolling along with what we've been doing. So this year, we've been doing this all year. When did we start doing the religion and technology thing?
No, I don't think it was all year. We started looking at the Vatican document on artificial intelligence.
Yes.
I feel like the Vatican II conversations were Easter time.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's been about 6 weeks or so.
We've been rolling along, and so been very engaging. I have gained much profit indeed from all of this. So we are looking at the second half of Gaudium et Spes, which eye-opening episode for me last week. Bud, wouldn't you say in the second half of this document, this is where they try to be the most relevant?
Right.
And I think sometimes that's why people maybe, if they either overlook it or maybe they read it too woodenly, and maybe there's sort of principles to be guiding us in our new technological and just sort of how things are on the ground ways without necessarily, it's funny, but I guess what I'm saying is like there should be a spirit to the end of Gaudium et Spes rather than thinking of it like very woodenly.
Yeah, so this is Vatican II's document on the church in the modern world like we talked about last week. And the first section of the document really lays the groundwork. It sort of casts the vision for what is being accomplished with Gaudium et Spes. I guess last week we did get into somewhat how some of it feels a bit time-bound. And I think you're right, Bo. It's kind of related to the fact that in the latter half of the document, it starts talking about real specific issues like marriage and family life, the economy, social justice, war and peace, and of course, as history moves forward, new issues arise. And so in this document, for instance, when it gets into war and peace, I think it really has in view the development of advanced weaponry. And it's writing in the wake of the United States, using nuclear weaponry. And so that's kind of front and center. But as things move on, like today, I would say things are even more complicated with the use of like drones and things like that, satellite technology. We've continued to see sort of the expansion of like a sort of blurring of the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. So, I mean, things have gotten almost thornier, but because there's that specificity to what it's treating, there is kind of like a time-bound feeling to parts of it.
And I mean, I'm not going to speak for Dr. Russell Hittinger here, who massive influence on my life, but he has made this point that without throwing disparagements on my end, I'm just making this as an observation. You see, as the Vatican has gone forward, I would say since Vatican II, that you start to get more policy-driven descriptions of things. And I don't mean this in like that's all they do, but just in general, right? You're not getting policy statements from the Vatican of 1650, really. I guess the Syllabus of Errors is sort of a policy manual, but not really, right? The Syllabus of Errors is very interesting because it's not only that he's making sort of like principles and then sometimes policies, but he's stating them as negatives and then affirming them or not. So it can get very...
It's really hard to read. My mind doesn't naturally work that way. Yeah. So as you're saying, it's presenting propositions that have to be condemned. And whenever I've read the syllabus, I've had to really slow down and think about each statement like 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, and so I guess you can say there's, Pius IX throwing out policies, What is it, Gregory the 14th or someone who came out against streetlights? So maybe that's a policy. Right. So I'm not trying to act like there's never been sort of practical ways in which encyclicals or documents that the popes have not, of course, tried to make rulings on current events. Like, absolutely not the case. Leo the 13th's encyclicals are chock full of him trying to address the signs of the times and things that are going on. But I do think it's fair, Bud, and tell me if I'm wrong, that there's more of a flavor going forward that's just sort of snowballed since then, where you'll have like Vatican documents quoting like the Kyoto Protocol or something like this, right? Where you're going to be like, oh, they're going to make a specific policy recommendation. And I think that's where you start to see that this gets difficult sometimes to go back and look at the documents and then sort of go, okay, what does it mean that this is a constitution of the church that sort of talks about things that are very time-bound? And certainly it's the case that we should keep. So weapons is a great one. Yeah. Like, it's very important in the modern world, after going through those world wars that we talked about last time, that if you're going to talk about the light of the world, you've got to talk about how Christ should make us think different about modern weaponry. Yeah. But the minute that the ink dried on these pages, the weaponry had already advanced, and it's advanced so much now that you go, how much of what's being said there, I'm not trying to say it's irrelevant, but what I'm getting at is I do think that if you're going to really imbibe what the Council Fathers were trying to get at, this is actually where you should go, okay, well, how do we apply this differently now? Whereas, let's just say some people decided that that's what they should do with the liturgy, and I don't think it was that clear from that document that that's what they were going for.
Yeah, and that's where I might sound like a critic of all sides, but I do think when addressing social issues, the church or its members have to be careful about falling into pitfalls in 2 different directions. And one is, you'll have conversations with some Catholics who are almost kind of allergic to any sort of Catholic social teaching, and will say, that's not really the purview of the church, it's not its expertise. A lot of times, like, maybe what's being said cuts against the grain of their deeply held political sensibilities, but right. I think that's wrongheaded in the sense that if you read the Gospels closely, our Lord is calling his followers to a different way of life, and Christ doesn't have this distinction between sort of like the spiritual realm that belongs to God and then the nuts and bolts of daily life. In fact, the passage that sometimes folks quote is like, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and what to God what belongs to God. And that's taken to mean like there's this real strict dichotomy. I think Christ is actually pressing his followers to sort of reevaluate this idea that, like, this part of my life naturally belongs to Caesar. He's sort of like pressing them in a sense like everything belongs to God. Now, you get into the writings of Paul and things like this, and of course we like pay taxes, we pray for our rulers and things like that. But what I'm saying is that Christ and his call involves all of life. Like, if you look at what he was calling his followers to, it had implications for how they spent their money, how they treated their enemies, and on down the line. On the flip side, and I wouldn't say this so much necessarily about like Vatican documents, but sometimes maybe bishops or theologians, as they sort of apply these things, when we address social issues, it's not that we're like another NGO or even like, I don't know, it always has to come back to Christ. And it has to be infused with our understanding of like where history's headed. So there is this way that we can sort of begin to talk about social and political issues and take on kind of the lingo of of like common public discourse, right? And I think Catholic theology needs to be stated in a different key.
Okay, and Bud, one that I think is very obvious, one that this is going to be maybe one of our more shots fired moments about Vatican II. Okay, I think what you said is exactly right, and I think one area where there was a glaring disregard to what you just said in what came afterwards is, okay, so the second part two, some problems of special urgency, right? So Gaudium et Spes is getting down to the nitty-gritty. Chapter 1, fostering the nobility of marriage and the family. But then how did people have a problem with Humanae Vitae? I mean, Humanae Vitae, I don't know how to not say this without this, like, sort of throwing in the political elements, but like the quote-unquote liberal wing of the church that was mad at Paul VI, did they not read this part? Because Humanae Vitae just seems like what we exactly said we hope a pope would do, right? Take the principles of this part of the document and then apply them to what I'm going to throw out, Bud, to use the word, the reigning technocratic paradigm at the time, where they tried to make marriage and conjugal love fit into the utilitarian calculus that that contraception was allowing in the world. I mean, Bud, this I'm just going to read a few parts of this. Authentic conjugal love will be more highly prized, and wholesome public opinion created about it if Christian couples give outstanding witness to the faithfulness and harmony in their love and to their educating their children also. Skip down a bit. Marriage and conjugal love are by their nature ordained toward the begetting and education of children. Yeah. Children are the supreme gift of marriage and contribute very substantially to the welfare of their parents. A little more. Parents should regard as their proper mission the task of transmitting human life and educating those to whom it has been transmitted. So, Bud, how did people read that and act like Paul VI did something radically, like, retrograde by making Humanae Vitae, which, I mean, Bud, to me, like the continuity of language between this part of Gaudium et Spes and what Paul VI said in applying principles stated here. Now, I mean, again, stating Beau preference, I wish they would have been less locucious. I think they could have been like more like tightly argued and maybe more at the level of principle. But there are clearly principles enumerated there that to be the light of the nations, we have to, on the forefront, maintain what is distinct about our understanding of marriage and conjugal love. And then Paul VI applies those principles to a specific challenge to the church. But a significant amount of the church freaked out, acting as if Vatican II wasn't enumerating principles about how we are the light of the nation, specifically in our understanding of marriage.
Well, I can tell you precisely what happened here, because this is an area where I've actually dug into the literature quite a bit. On a previous episode, we talked some about Pope Benedict and his sort of guidance in interpreting the council, and he said there was a council of the media, and there was this kind of like narrative about what happened that took off, that went beyond what the text of the document said. Now, here's where you do find theologians and commentators who act like, well, if we just stick with the text, it's almost like constitutional interpretation. Yeah. How I feel is like it is, it's sometimes, especially in a document that's this lengthy, interpretation is always going to be like fraught with disagreement and things like that. But getting back to my point, like with Gaudium et Spes, there were things that were said about the document that led, I think, certain theologians and commentators who wanted things to change to expect that there was going to be change. So historically, it did happen that some bishops said we should speak directly and forthrightly about new modes of artificial contraception. And Paul VI asked that to be tabled. He said he was going to form a council, like a commission that would look at the matter and speak to it directly outside of the council. So that took place. The second thing, and I'll be curious, we didn't prep for this before the show, but I mean, a huge thing that I'm going to just use sort of like broad language here. So if you talk about like liberal Catholics or those who maybe dissent from a teaching or want something to change in this respect, they say that previous to Vatican II, the church was clear that there were two ends to marriage. The primary end was the procreation and education of children. The secondary end was the unitive nature of the act, that the spouse is like, it's a form of like mutual support, or maybe even like I know theologians use the language of like mitigation of concupiscence. We don't have to get in that on the show today. But Gaudium et Spes does, it sort of avoids or like sidesteps that specific approach. So it talks about the ends of marriage.
Yes. Yep.
And the passages that you quoted, I think they're moving in the direction, if not like explicitly stating what Paul VI later says. But I don't know, there's this kind of like commentary post-council to say like, well, we no longer operate with this idea of like the primary and secondary ends of marriage. And so a marriage can be open to life in its wholeness without maybe necessarily being bound to that openness in every single act of the marriage.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know very well where the curveballs got thrown. I'm just saying you kind of have to make up your mind, don't you, that if you go, this is the greatest council since bread was sliced, then how do you look at where it actually gets to enumerating principles? And like I said, quickly we can turn to the next one, but when it starts talking about the development of nations, I think it's like helplessly squishy. I mean, like, yes, good. We should develop nations, and all that, but they're bringing up principles here, and they say it's precisely these principles that will make us a light into the nation. And again, I can't help but think about this, that one of the most dominant technologies, hovering around this time, Bud, is the media, certainly, but it's definitely contraception, which creates a whole new world in which to even understand human life itself. I mean, I know we've talked about this in other episodes where you go from, you're assuming that if you have a conjugal act, it most likely, or it's very much possible to have a child, to I am going to make a technological decision to stop using some technology in order to even make a child possible. That is flipping the world on its head. And people, but this is the principles they're going to ignore. Like, we've tried to be pretty neutral about this one, but I read that and I could not believe what I was reading, knowing what happened.
Well, you use the language of shots fired, and on the show, like, we don't have to be shy about what we believe. And in this respect, I think Paul VI ended up being prophetic. And if you look at his kind of predictions about where this would lead, and we don't have time to get in the show today, but certainly like the sexual revolution is rooted in the advent and widespread use of this technology, and all sorts of dominoes fell in its wake. I would say almost like if you worked backwards, so say like a person who's coming into the church or deepening their faith about Catholicism, and they stumble upon Humana Vitae. Humana Vitae is pretty brief and to the point, and I understand, like, especially those who have maybe been living a different way, like how it's a challenging teaching when you first hear it. You could almost move backwards to Gaudium et Spes, and I think it has like sort of a beautiful theological treatment about marriage and the purpose of marriage, and it's, like the service that it provides to society, etc., that kind of expands upon what Humana Vitae treats very specifically.
Absolutely, and this is where I'm saying that if you have, again, like I said, I'm not shy to point this out. I think the documents of Vatican II, I think the documents, Bud, of the 1983 Catechism are too wordy most of the time for most people to be able to use them in a sort of like way in which you would, at least in the past, they seem to be used. That's fine. They're trying to do something different. What I am going to say, though, is when these council documents or when the catechism get brass tacks and elucidate principles, how is it that that's when people decide to like sidestep what they're saying? But I was very much struck by this. The church has been going round and round, and by the church I mean like the church in general, its members, and we'll talk about things like contraception, but it's a technology. We don't talk about it enough as a technological development that is a ground-shifting one. It's not just the content of what how your life is different once you apprise yourself of this technology. It is world-shifting, and it lines up with the great media explosion that's about to happen. It's almost like an inverse, but like as the demographic winter starts to set in because of the profound use of this technology, media exponentially replicates. I mean, if you want to be like, going too much, being too crazy about it, it's almost like there's an inverse ratio. The more we contracept, the more the more media technologies breeds like rabbits, and there's just more of it.
Well, that's where I encourage our listeners who do have that time to dive into some of the church's Catholic social teaching, starting with something like Rerum Novarum, moving up through the 20th century. I think John Paul II had some great encyclicals. But what you'll see there, and I think in this document, Bo, is that it really is a network that holds together as a web of teachings. What I mean by that is if you isolate one or more of them, it's going to kind of fall apart. So what the church teaches about laborers and how they should be treated and how workers should be paid a living wage by which they can support a family, and then what it teaches about the openness of life and a just society, all of those things hang together. And so, I mean, it cuts both directions. You have Catholics on the left who feel like they're piss and vinegar about the economic teachings, but then they want to check out what the church says about marriage and family.
Absolutely.
On the right, sometimes you have those who they'll go to the mat for the teachings about marriage and family and then sort of shrug their shoulders about the economic teachings.
No, and I mean, look, a phrase much derided, but it's seamless garment. Whatever it got used for, and I mean, Bud, you and I weren't Catholics in the 80s and 90s, so we didn't have to live through how that was bandied about. It's absolutely the case, though. To segment the faith, I'm not acting like there's not stuff that might be more or less important, or if you only have 5 hours in your day, how much should you commit to this, that, or the other? And it's obviously the case that the Eucharist is the source and summit of our faith. No arguments for me there. But to act like there's sort of boxes you can check about their importance, I have to admit, rereading this document and what I sort of hear about it from both sides, I really think it could very much use a rereading where people are more charitable to the document itself and not the sort of ways in which it's been used. I go back to, I'm with Karl Rahner, who himself said, it was too optimistic. It should have talked about sin more. I agree with all of those things levied. But I really think, Bud, that there's a strong way that people missed some of the details that got swept up in, like you said, the sort of feverish arguments that happened right afterwards.
Well, and it's worth clinging to it at the end of the day. We're not a pie-in-the-sky faith, and of course we have an eternal destiny, and this earth is not our home. But I really think with the direction of things, I was just trying to recall the name of our friend Charlie Camosi's book, Losing Our Dignity, How Secularized Medicine is Undermining Fundamental Human Equality. There's all sorts of ways in our culture where we're moving to kind of this utilitarian space where the value of a person is based on what they contribute. And I really do think the Catholic Church, with its holistic teaching in these areas, is sort of like the last fortress still defending this idea that each human person has intrinsic dignity. Mm-hmm. Whether it doesn't matter how small they are, how old they are, if they're coming from a different country. We see in the stranger, the infirm, the unborn, a precious life worth preserving. And I think it's really, I don't know. Sometimes I think about with our show, people hear Catholic social teaching, they're like, who are these guys? But I really think there's immense value here, but it hangs together as a whole. We have to be able to defend that.
And I mean, look, I know that it wasn't necessarily the way it was being put at the time, but I can't help but read all of this back through Pope Francis's reutilization of Romano Guardini. Yeah. This is the technocratic paradigm, and as much as I think there's some optimism in there about if we go engage the modern world, we have so much that it can teach, and what it talked about secret desires, and we talked about in the last show. For all that, it really does hint at, it can see the great utilitarianization of man and the sort of rendering of that dignity, to throwing it, as it were, under the wheels of efficiency. And I guess, Bud, maybe just being who I am, I kind of wish that they would roll with that a little bit more. Maybe they thought it was really obvious that the world had seen so much carnage that it didn't need reminded. It turns out the world needed reminded again and again and again, but just right out of the gate in part 2, talking about marriage, I think people gave it short shrift, and we've suffered from that. This is The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. We're rolling along with our Vatican II consideration of the documents thereof under the lens of religion and technology. This is the second part on Gaudium et Spes. And I keep saying it different every time I say it, but the document about the church as the light of the nations. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us, considering the documents of Vatican II. Under the lens of religion and technology, looking at Gaudium et Spes, the light of the nations. This is the part 2. We're dealing with it again, and we're looking at the second half of the document. But I got to say, I felt the ire rise up in me to defend part of what I thought people have overread. I will be honest, this was sort of the rest of it. A lot of the sort of issues sometimes I feel that people have when they run into what they call, quote unquote, the spirit of Vatican II, or maybe how some of the documents that come out of, maybe not the Pope himself, like you said, but sort of the Vatican in general. It is probably the rest of these part 2 elements where you get that sort of idea. This is where we get about development of nations. We talk about the good news in culture, the development of an international community. And as much as I'm very much rowdy about them talking about the avoidance of war head on, and it makes a lot of sense that they would after all of them living through World War II, if not World War I as well. I got to say, Bud, I do think this is where when people say, oh, the church sometimes too readily deals with the rest of the world in the second half of the 20th century into like what we're living into, that it's too willing to be just another NGO. That maybe this is where some people get what they think is the justification for doing so. I'm not acting like that's what the document set out to do, but as much as I wanted to defend part of what I thought was missed on the first part of the show, I see where this can sort of kind of roll out.
But I think when we get in these latter sections, they are helpful entry points so the theme that we've been running with is the Vatican Council documents and media. Mm-hmm. And really, when you get to the section on economic development, the document, so Gaudium et Spes, the Church of the Modern World, it does have in view sort of like in the background, the Industrial Revolution and then the acceleration of that in the 20th century. And so I think this part really speaks in a prophetic mode to especially Catholics in the developed West. Mm-hmm. So you see here, like this is, I'm quoting part of section 63, many people, especially in economically advanced areas, seem to be dominated by economics. Almost all of their personal and social lives are permeated with a kind of economic mentality. And this is true of nations that favor a collective economy as well as of other nations. So it says there's this way in which culture has moved to a place where the only or the primary consideration that's at the forefront of all like sort of cultural conversations is the economy. And we turn into like just workers qua workers without that transcendental spiritual nature of man truly in view. And I like how the document stops to say, like, look, this is taking place in communist countries, but in other places as well, when, in fact, the ultimate end and basic purpose of economic production does not consist merely in producing more goods, nor in profit or prestige. This production is meant to be at the service of humanity in its totality. And then the document begins to unpack some of the problems that arise if you operate in such a way that just like profit is the only sort of consideration when it comes to whether economic activity is right or wrong. And so you see the emergence of vast inequalities in a time of history where like we've got some of the wealthiest societies in the world that exist side by side with places where, you know, folks barely have enough to eat. Beyond that, you know, the owners of production end up sort of like not taking into account, not simply the inequities that we might see in wages or in compensation, but also not really respecting the spiritual nature of man in terms of like what's expected of laborers when it comes to how much they work or whether or not they have holy days off.
Yeah, and I mean, look, and I know it seems like I came out maybe out of the break negative, but I'm going to read 2 paragraphs here, and I know that it might be a little long, but on one hand, Bud, you're going to hear like, oh, we're having these debates today, but it also goes to show you like how it's difficult. I mean, let me read them here. Justice and equity likewise require that the mobility, which is necessary in a developing economy, be regulated in such a way as to keep the life of individuals and their families from becoming insecure and precarious. When workers come from another country or district and contribute to the economic advancement of a nation or region by their labor, all discrimination as regards wages and working conditions must be carefully avoided. All the people, moreover, above all, the public authorities, must treat them not as mere tools of production, but as persons, and must help them to bring their families to live with them and to provide themselves with a decent dwelling. They must also see to it that these workers are incorporated into the social life of the country or region that receives them. Boy, howdy, bud, is that relevant. But then here's the kicker, and this is what I mean about like the sort of ambivalence about trying to speak at the moment, but then it gets difficult. So here's the end of that paragraph. Employment opportunities, however, should be created in their own areas as far as possible, which are like absolutely true. Yeah. There's one way in which if you have societies that are constantly migrating to another, what's happening to the place in which the migrants are coming from, let alone what it might do to put like strains on social webs, in the place we're going, etc. But man, is that a loaded sentence. As far as possible, make jobs at the... Okay, all right. So then there's this next paragraph. In economic affairs, which today are subject to change, boy, howdy they are, as in the new forms of industrial society in which automation, for example, is advancing. That's 1965, by the way. Care must be taken that sufficient and suitable work and the possibility of the appropriate technical and professional formation are furnished. The livelihood and the human dignity, especially of those who are in very difficult conditions because of illness or old age, must be guaranteed. So, but on one hand, those are evergreen paragraphs. What's funny is to think, though, that in speaking to the times in 1965, or whenever specifically this was, on one hand, the words have stayed the same, but the grounding of those words have totally changed. And those two paragraphs mean almost completely different things. And so this is where, if we believe in sort of elucidating principles at the top level of Catholic social teaching, and then very much press on the case that what this is supposed to spur is prayerful, intentional dwelling on what does it mean to make those principles alive and well in each particular case, that to me starts to be like where some of the disconnect comes. It's like it's not enough just to like put thumbs up to those paragraphs because it's such an ever-changing, but to your point that you made earlier, because people aren't willing, because they bifurcate or sort of like take this in piecemeal, the way in which all of this is threaded together, for instance, peace, for instance, how does an international community pick itself up from the bootstraps after what just happened? How do you do this in the middle of a Cold War? All of those things are the hard work that needed to go forward. And too often, as I think we've been hinting at, especially with this document was used to sort of verify what people already were assuming they wanted to do anyway.
Yeah, and I think the church has always threaded this needle so carefully. And you think back to the 19th century when someone like Marx writes his Communist Manifesto, and why did this publication just like seize the minds of people in Europe? It's because many laborers did feel downtrodden. Like he spoke to the signs of the times. Now, the church has always like said in response to those sorts of movements that like it affirms private property under certain conditions, right? But as this document points out, there is the universal destination of goods, that all of the world belongs to God, properly speaking. Anything that we own or have stewardship over is given to us as a gift from God that we're called to use justly. And so that sort of idea has implications both on a personal level and on a societal level. As Catholics, as members of the mystical body of Christ, like we're called out of the abundance of what God has given us to share that with those in need. And it's not sort of an optional, like kind of like nice thing that we can pull off. You go back to some of the early church fathers like Basil of Caesarea or St. John Chrysostom. They say like if you have an extra jacket in your closet that you don't need, you're stealing from the poor. Like it belongs to those without, right? And so, I mean, in some ways, like I think as Catholics, myself included, we need to go back to that and listen to someone like John Chrysostom. He was willing to, on some occasions, like melt down the precious vessels that were used in the Mass to serve those in need. Now, there's a way, of course, we're going to get into like where the church can have beautiful worship spaces and like give God the proper honor that's due him through dignity in our worship and things like that. But I mean, I think in today's world, like we're maybe not ready enough to listen to the prophetic denunciations, perhaps of sort of like resting on our abundance. On the flip side, and this is where, man, you know, like the circles that I run in, I mean, obviously, like I'm rubbing shoulders more often with like sort of like conservative Catholics, right? And we hear these sorts of things, we think like, oh, that's like a lib cat thing, or, you know, like maybe that's John Paul II and Francis, but we go back to the popes of the golden age of the church. No, you go back to, like you were mentioning, Gregory the 14th or Pius the 9th, right? And they're throwing flames on these topics. And so as Catholics, we need to recover sort of this idea of like the social kingship of Christ, that not only individuals can recognize that Christ is king, but whole societies can. And part of the way that they do so is by having just laws when it comes to the just use of the resources that they have as a people.
Well, I mean, look, man, this could make a lot of American Catholics on both sides mad, but do you know who most of the Council Fathers have in mind when they're talking about, like, oh, in terms of development, in terms of, you know, like economy and things like this, how do we be a light of the nations? But they're talking about the Christian democratic parties of Europe, right? And I'll be rude, Americans are woefully unaware of the statecraft that was attempted. And Bud, clearly it didn't work, you know, like perfectly, because Europe's in the state it is. And you could even make arguments, I mean, some people make arguments that, you know, very quickly, because of what Christian democratic parties tried to do, that they sort of, you know, it's like selling their birthright for pottage, right? Like from the story of Jacob and Esau. But all that to be said, Bud, to not have a sort of working history of what was attempted in post-war Europe by the Christian democratic parties to say we are going to try to very much specifically influence at a governmental level. Now, look, this is hard for America because America's huge and we're not parliamentary, and it's a lot harder to have coalitions. I mean, I can go on and on and on. But I will say that the ways in which Catholics sort of inadvertently believe that they have to fall into the two-party system because it's all that they know, I mean, but I really do think that it would behoove them to say, okay, there was at least attempts before Vatican II, but really, really afterwards, to try to imagine what it would be like to pick up the pieces of Europe after World War II and have in mind precisely these principles of Catholic social teaching. I think we get the UN Declaration on Human Rights because of those parties, for instance. I know that's before Vatican II. Yeah. But, I mean, it's things like this, like Jacques Mariton's talking about these sort of things. Again, very quickly going to say, obviously not a sterling success because of what happened in Europe, but that's not to say that there weren't many lessons to learn in that regard.
Yeah, and that's where our involvement in those sort of political movements requires a great deal of prudence and prayers for wisdom. I guess on the radio I should be careful talking about political parties. I was going to talk about a fledgling one that I've thrown some weight behind, but that's okay. We'll move on to warfare so I can not lose our nonprofit status.
There you go.
When this document treats warfare as well, it gets into how emerging technology has sort of like shifted the ground in terms of the questions that the church has to address. So paragraph 80, the proliferation of scientific weapons has immeasurably magnified the horror and wickedness of war. Warfare conducted with such weapons can inflict immense and indiscriminate havoc, which goes far beyond the bounds of legitimate defense. I mean, I think Catholics reading this in the wake of two world wars recognize immediately what's in view. And then sort of, prescinding from that, like the document goes on to say, like, any act of war that's directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities is unjust, right?
Yes.
And that's not simply with the use of atomic weapons, but something like the firebombing of Dresden. It goes both ways in World War II. The Axis, of course.
The Blitzkrieg.
Bombing London.
Yeah, the bombing raids in London, the Blitzkrieg. I mean,
no attention to like military targets versus civilian targets. So,
and I mean, look, this is one where you go, you can talk about the modern discussion about prohibitions of war changing and still be just war, but argue, I'm not saying we have to believe this, but like certainly this is where you start to have the beginning of threshold arguments, which is to say, in principle, I believe in the just war tradition because I believe what the church has taught, but it's either impossible or nearly impossible or rare to imagine a war using modern weapons that wouldn't fall befoul of just war principles. And I think that's what they're getting about with scientific weapons. And if the power of the nuclear bomb hovers greatly over this, the sort of in a sort of way, now we go the opposite way. Precision weapons that we have now, because they're sort of, it's not that they're necessarily going to kill as many as like died in Hiroshima, but the sort of way in which they can just scrub a human from the earth through, the power of digital and satellite power. I mean, that's something that this document couldn't have thought of, but laid down principles for us to say, can we truly, in the here and now, imagine war in the same way, even if we are just war ethicists?
Yeah, a bit of a bunny trail if it's all right, but I've found particularly horrifying, like anytime I've stumbled upon an article or a video that gets into like drone warfare.
Yes.
And part of it for me is, so war is usually, if not always, horrific. Like, I mean, you watch like the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, and it's kind of like almost dizzying to consider human beings, like the courage involved and the horrors they had to face, like entering into a scenario like that.
Yep.
But when I've seen like, and I, of course, like I try to move on quickly if someone like posts a video to social media of drone weapons being used, but it's, I mean, in previous eras of human history, there was an attempt sometimes to have like, this is the battleground, this is where the combatants face each other, and in the human encounter, like that's one of the worst parts of war. But in that close encounter, you also got a sense that you were up against a human being. The distance that's created with the use of like drone strikes, or like you said, precision weaponry that can use technology to scrub a life or take a life, where the person in control of it, or perhaps even, like we've moved to a place where like they're programmed to target certain persons. It's like you lose that sense that you're even taking a life. I think.
And I mean, I'll be frank, and I mean, this is in like the Ukraine-Russian war, and like not to speak in any sort of ways to get this politically, but like Ukraine made that attack where they hid drones, drove them deep into Russia with trucks, and then unleashed attacks deep inside of Russian, targets. And even if every single one of those targets is military, I'm not trying to like in any way adjudicate the specifics, but we live in a world now that when you hear of attacks that go off like that with new technology, I think most people immediately go, oh man, that means that can be used against us next. And I mean, especially as Americans, bud, what was the big nice thing about being in America? 2 oceans. Mm-hmm. And you think we're creating the technologies that will make that not the thing it used to be. Right. I mean, if you think the Cuban Missile Crisis was a problem because Cuba's 90 miles away from Florida shores, they probably are developing, if not have, drones that can fly from Cuba into the United States. And I mean, not to like freak people out, but this is the sort of appropriate awe, terror, and regard, I think, that this was trying to warn us about.
Yeah, and this is where I didn't realize necessarily we were going to go into this much depth about just war theory, but now that it's brought up, you think about, I think as Catholics we have to recognize the level of sacrifice that's required to be committed to acting justly in instances where we unfortunately maybe have to use coercion to defend innocent human life, right? And so these questions can never devolve into kind of a utilitarian calculus in terms of like this sort of mathematical attempt to say like, well, this approach is going to save this many lives and this the alternative. No, there are means of war that are ruled out by their very nature.
Yep.
And that's going to sometimes require Catholics to say like, we're gonna follow a course of action that we know may require people to make like significant sacrifices. And that's where, Bo, I think in those conversations, but even like rippling outwards, we can start to infuse some of the discussion with a real theological key. So I don't know, like I do think the treatment of like the arms race here is quite helpful, because that says there's a certain mentality that starts to develop among leaders where it's just like this kind of feverish attempt to just amass as much weaponry as possible. And there's this like false sense like, that's ultimately what's going to preserve our lives, right? And it says like all sorts of other concerns and issues aren't addressed because we're spending all this like vast amounts of wealth on weaponry. But it's also just a totally misguided perspective to think like, oh, if we only just like arm ourselves to the teeth, that's when we'll achieve true safety.
And dude, look, this is where they made a principle that actually applies to all sorts of other things. The artificial intelligence race is the same way. Like, think about how much R&D is blown on AI right now, and a lot of it, like, just to shots fired over stuff that Bo predicts will never manifest, like general intelligence. There's all sorts of stuff that AI could absolutely help humanity on, and it's mostly ignored because they want to make a stupid talking robot because they watch too many sci-fi movies. So shots fired there. But like, even the sort of like way in which people will want to use, like, to weaponize AI to sort of overtake our enemies economically or whatever, like this, it's a arms race. And then you go back to what you were saying, that to be just war is to willing to make sacrifices in order to fight war correctly. But this is like, if pro-life people, and they're absolutely right to say, yes, if a woman brings a baby to term and has the baby, it will be a sacrifice she has to make, but it's the right thing to do because human life has dignity. Well, bud, how many times do people who make that argument are unwilling to say the same thing about war? And we have to be consistent. In a similar way, right? When, like, if people are like, oh, my body, my choice, you're like, my body, my choice is the same argument that, invading countries say. Yeah. And so we can't say either. Like, we are, yes, telling the world that they will have to make sacrifices in order to live rightly with their neighbors, with the unborn, with the weak, etc., with developing technologies. But if we're unwilling to do that, this is a spiral. We will pull apart with the single thread the entirety of the garment.
I'm not really waiting with bated breath for our elected officials to embrace this sort of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know what that looks like. Our public discourse, our political arguments are so infused with, I think, language and ideas that just runs contrary to the faith. But I do hope as Catholics, and I'm preaching to myself here, that we can begin to think about what both sacred scripture and tradition says on this. You think back to the Old Testament. Some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord. There's all sorts of warnings all throughout Scripture. From the very beginning, when Adam and Eve turned from the Word of God to trust, sort of like they want to sort of create a life for themselves, Tower of Babel, where as human beings, we fall into this trap thinking that, like, our neighbor is the enemy, like we have to protect ourselves from those around us, and that ripples out into other countries, and we end up in this place where we're just riddled with fear and this kind of anxiety of the other. I'm not saying it's easy. It does require sacrifice. I like the analogy of the pro-life movement. But as families, as parishes, how can we begin to look at the world differently than seeing it in those terms?
And I think that's a good end to Gaudium et Spes. I think I have been my eyes open in new ways to a document that I often think either gets used in a utilitarian way itself, or despite its flaws, I think has a lot to teach us. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, stick around. We're so happy to have you with us. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Thank you to Imaging Ingredients. Like we've said before, you make this show possible, and we are very, very grateful. We hope you've enjoyed the show. As talked about before, this has been us wrapping up our conversation on Gaudium et Spes. We will, of course, move on to consider more Vatican II documents in light of religion and technology. We'll keep trucking along, as it were. Bud, great show. How can people join us with our prayer life here on Iowa Catholic Radio?
So please do join us in our prayer life. You can go to iowacatholicradio.com and click on the program schedule. That will have all of our great talk shows and things, but also a schedule of the prayer life here on the radio station. In
a similar way, if you want to see what's going on in and around the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com, click on the Iowa Catholic Radio events, and you'll get to see all sorts of wonderful things, how you can join in on the fun that's happening in the listening area. And folks, remember that this ministries is not just the people on the mics, behind the boards, or behind the desks. It's your ministry as well. You make it possible with your prayers, with your volunteer hours, but very much so with your donations. So please make sure to consider donating to Iowa Catholic Radio by going to iowacatholicradio.com and hitting the donate button, or you can go call 515-223-1150, call or text 515-223-1150 to donate. Bud, great show as always.
For sure. Thanks, Bo.
This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our families, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.